The day my father was buried, my brother handed me a manila envelope and told me to open it at home. He said it was from Dad's lawyer. He said it with a smile I had never seen on him before. Tight, satisfied, like a man who had already won a game I didn't know we were playing. I should have opened it right there in the funeral home parking lot. But I was still holding a single white rose from the casket spray and my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I thought maybe grief just needed one more hour before the world started demanding things from me again. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I spent the last 4 years of my life driving 40 minutes each way, 3 times a week, to sit beside my father while dialysis machines hummed and nurses changed shifts. I learned what creatinine levels meant. I learned how to file insurance appeals. I learned that the most exhausting thing in the world is watching someone you love disappear slowly and still showing up the next time anyway. My brother Daniel spent those same 4 years in Phoenix building what he called his investment portfolio. He came home twice. Once for Thanksgiving 2 years ago when he ate and left before dessert. Once for the last Christmas, when Dad was already too weak to sit at the table for long. Daniel stayed 4 days that trip. He spent most of it on his phone in the guest room. I am not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I'm telling you this so you understand what I walked into the morning after the funeral, when I finally opened the envelope. My father's name was Raymond. He was a quiet man, the kind who fixed things with his hands and expressed love through action, showing up, building shelves, driving you somewhere when your car broke down. He grew up in rural Tennessee and came to Ohio at 22 and never left. He worked at the same manufacturing plant for 31 years. He was not a wealthy man by any standard measure, but he owned his house outright. He had a savings account he never touched. He had a life insurance policy he'd been paying into since before I was born. My mother left when I was 9 and Daniel was 16. She didn't die or disappear, she just chose a different life in a different city and sent birthday cards that arrived 3 days late for the next decade. Daniel always said she left because of me. He said it casually, the way older brothers sometimes say cruel things without understanding that the words stick forever. I never fully believed him, but I never fully stopped wondering either. After she left, it was just Dad and us. Daniel graduated, went to college on a partial scholarship, and came back only on holidays for a while before eventually stopping even that. I stayed, not because I had no options. I stayed because the house on Aldermore Lane smelled like my father's coffee and motor oil, and leaving it felt like leaving something I couldn't name. I went to a community college nearby. I became a physical therapist's assistant. I made decent money. I dated a man named Greg for 2 years, who eventually told me I was emotionally unavailable because I spent too many evenings at my father's house instead of his apartment. I didn't fight that hard to keep him. I think I knew, even then, what the next few years were going to look like, and Greg was not built for it. When Dad was diagnosed with end-stage renal disease, I was 27. The nephrologist used a lot of words I had to Google that night. I sat on my bedroom floor with my laptop and learned everything I could. I called Daniel the next morning. He said it was a lot to process and that he'd call back in a few days. He called back in 11 days. I am not telling you this to build a case. I am telling you so that when I describe what happened after the funeral, you understand the full weight of it. The morning after we buried Dad, I sat at the kitchen table in his house, my childhood home, the house I had a key to, the house I had cleaned and maintained, and paid the heating bills for twice when Dad's fixed income didn't stretch far enough, and I opened the envelope. There was a letter from a lawyer named Patterson, and a single-page document that appeared to be a summary of an updated will. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time very slowly, the way you reread something when your brain refuses to accept what your eyes are telling it. According to the document, my father had updated his will 14 months prior. The house on Aldermore Lane, the savings account, and the proceeds from the life insurance policy totaling somewhere near $340,000 when combined were to go entirely to Daniel. My name appeared once, in a line near the bottom. A jewelry box containing my mother's old things, and any personal effects Claire identifies as meaningful. I sat there for a long time. The coffee I had made went cold. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard, and the sound felt very far away. I called my father's regular lawyer, a woman named Mrs. Okafor, who had handled his basic documents for years. I had met her twice at Dad's request. When she picked up, I told her my father had passed, and that I was calling about his estate documents. There was a pause before she spoke. She said she had prepared a will for my father 2 years ago. She said that to her knowledge, it had not been updated since. She said she would need to look into it further, but that her records indicated I was listed as co-beneficiary with my brother on all major assets. I asked her about a lawyer named Patterson. She didn't recognize the name. I drove to Daniel's hotel that afternoon. He was staying at a Marriott 20 minutes from the house because, as he put it, he needed space to grieve. He opened the door in a polo shirt, looking rested in a way that felt indecent. I held up the document. I asked him who Patterson was. He told me Dad had wanted to make changes. He said Dad had expressed for years that he felt I was too dependent on the family home and that leaving me the house wouldn't be good for my growth. He said this with the same careful steadiness of someone who had rehearsed it. I asked him when he had last spoken to Dad about this. He said the details weren't important and that we should let the legal process move forward. I told him I had called Mrs. Okafor. I watched something flicker across his face, brief and controlled, like a light switched off behind his eyes, and then he told me she hadn't been involved in Dad's affairs for years. He told me I needed to accept this. He told me Dad had loved me, but had made his choices. Then he closed the door. I sat in my car in the Marriott parking lot for 20 minutes. I was not crying. I was doing something quieter than crying, the kind of still that comes when your brain is working very hard and your body has simply stopped participating. I had one thought, clear and steady. Something is wrong here and I am going to find out what. I went back to the house that night with a different purpose. I wasn't grieving anymore, or rather, I was, but grief had moved to one side to make room for something more focused. I went through my father's filing cabinet. I had done this before, plenty of times, when he needed a document or forgot where something was. I knew his system. The folder labeled Legal Important contained Mrs. Okafor's will from 2 years ago. I photographed every page with my phone. I also found something else, bank statements spanning the last 18 months. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but when you live close to someone for years, you develop a sense of their patterns, and these statements had a pattern I didn't recognize. 11 withdrawals over 14 months, each one between $8,000 and $9,500, each one just under the federal reporting threshold. Each one made it a branch 45 minutes from Dad's house, a branch he had never in my memory visited. I photographed those too. I didn't sleep that night. The following morning, I called Mrs. Okafor back and told her everything. The document, the unknown lawyer Patterson, the withdrawals. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she told me she wanted to refer me to someone. She gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in estate litigation and elder financial abuse. His name was Mr. Delaney. I was in his office 2 days later. I laid everything on his desk. The will from Mrs. Okafor's files, the document Daniel had given me, the bank statements. Mr. Delaney looked at everything carefully and quietly. Then he looked up and told me that what I was describing, if accurate, was a serious matter. He told me the document Daniel had provided showed several characteristics that warranted immediate forensic review. He told me the withdrawal pattern in the bank statements was consistent with what his office saw regularly in elder financial exploitation cases. He asked me if my father had shown any signs of cognitive decline in his final months. I thought about the last 6 months of Dad's life. The dialysis, the fatigue, the days when he would lose track of what we had been talking about halfway through a sentence. The way his hands shook when he signed forms. The way he sometimes looked at me and seemed to be working very hard to remember the word for something ordinary. I told Mr. Delaney yes. He told me we had a case worth investigating. What followed was 3 months that I can only describe as living 2 lives simultaneously. On the surface, I continued working my regular shifts, seeing my patients, driving the same roads. Underneath, I was in a constant correspondence with Mr. Delaney's office, providing documents, answering questions, signing authorizations for financial record subpoenas. Daniel called once during that period. He asked when I planned to vacate Dad's house so he could list it with a realtor. I told him I was still working through some things. He told me not to drag this out and that it would be easier for both of us if I cooperated. There was no warmth in his voice. There was also, I noticed, no grief. The forensic document examiner's report came back 5 weeks after I hired Mr. Delaney. The signature on the updated will, the one Daniel had handed me in a parking lot the day of our father's funeral, did not match the signature samples taken from documents my father had signed throughout his life. The pressure patterns were wrong. The letter formations in his name were inconsistent with every authentic sample they had. It was not my father's signature. The banking records told a second story. The branch where those 11 withdrawals were made was 3 miles from Daniel's best friend's house in Ohio, a man named Kevin, who still lived in the area and whom Daniel had stayed with during his last 2 visits home. Security footage from the bank, obtained through the subpoena, showed a man making those withdrawals. The footage was not perfectly clear, but the man was tall, with a particular way of holding his shoulders that I recognized from 31 years of watching my brother walk into rooms. The total amount withdrawn from those 11 transactions, $98,500. I want to tell you about a moment that happened before any of this. Before the lawyer, before the documents, before I understood what was happening. It was the night before the funeral. I was at the house alone, going through some of Dad's things to find a photograph for the service. I found a box in his closet I had never seen before, pushed behind his good shoes and a winter coat he never wore anymore. Inside the box were letters. Not many, maybe 15, bound with a rubber band. They were all from Daniel. They were dated across the last 2 years of Dad's life. Most of them were short, but there were 2 that were not. One was written 8 months before Dad died. In it, Daniel described what I was doing for Dad not as care, but as control. He told Dad I was keeping him dependent on me. He told Dad that I had convinced Dad he couldn't manage without me, so that I could eventually take everything. He told Dad he was worried I was isolating him. The second letter, written 6 months before Dad died, was more specific. It suggested Dad consider updating his estate plans with a different lawyer who could approach things more objectively. It named Patterson. It said Daniel only wanted what was fair, and that fair meant accounting for the years Daniel had stayed away and built a life, while I had chosen to stay close and benefit from the proximity. I read both letters sitting on my father's closet floor. I thought about how tired Dad had seemed in his last year, how sometimes he seemed worried in a way he couldn't explain, or sad in a way that felt different from the illness. I wondered how many of these letters had arrived while I was driving 40 minutes to sit beside him. I wondered what he had thought, reading them, too fatigued to sort through the manipulation in them. I put the letters in my bag and said nothing to anyone until I was in Mr. Delaney's office. He said they were significant. The legal process does not move the way it does in movies or stories where everything resolves in one climactic courtroom scene. There were filings and continuances, and a mediation session that fell apart in the first 20 minutes when Daniel's attorney attempted to suggest the bank withdrawals were authorized cash gifts. Mr. Delaney had the surveillance footage, he had the forensic analysis, he had the letters, he had Mrs. Okafor's sworn statement about the original will. Daniel's attorney asked for a recess. When the mediation resumed, Daniel was very still in his chair. He no longer looked like a man who had already won. He looked like someone recalculating rapidly and not liking any of the numbers. The settlement agreement took another 6 weeks to finalize. I will not detail every term. What I will tell you is this. The original will misses. Okafor's will, the one my father had actually signed, was upheld. The fraudulent document was formally invalidated. The $98,500 in unauthorized withdrawals was categorized as financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Ohio law, a finding that carried consequences well beyond a civil settlement. Daniel's attorney negotiated strenuously on several points. He did not succeed on the ones that mattered. I also want to tell you that Kevin, Daniel's friend, the one whose house was 3 miles from the bank branch, called Mr. Delaney's office 4 days before the final settlement. He said he had been carrying something heavy and needed to say it. He confirmed that Daniel had used his home as a base during the visits. He confirmed he had been present for at least one of the bank trips. He said he had not fully understood at the time what was happening. Whether that is true, I cannot say. But his statement removed the last avenue Daniel's attorney had. It is now 8 months since we buried my father. I still live on Aldermore Lane. The house no longer smells like motor oil because I've done some renovating not to erase him, but to make it mine the way it always should have been. I have not spoken to Daniel since the settlement was finalized. I don't expect to. The grief for the brother I thought I had, or maybe the brother I always hoped he might become, sits differently than the grief for my father. It is smaller, quieter, and less clean. What I know now, in a way I could not have articulated before any of this happened, is that love is not proximity. It is not geography or availability. but presence does mean something. Showing up means something, not as a transaction, not as a down payment on an inheritance, but as the unremarkable, irreplaceable act of being there. I was there. Whatever else Daniel tried to rewrite, he could not rewrite that. I used a portion of the estate to establish a small scholarship at the community college I attended, in my father's name. It's for students in health sciences programs, the kind of student I once was, trying to build something useful in a life that didn't have a lot of extra room. The scholarship committee met for the first time last month. There were 3 applicants. Dad would have liked that. He always said the only things worth spending money on were tools and education, because both of them let you do the next thing. I still have the letters from the box in the closet. I have read them only twice since that night on the floor. I keep them because they are the truest record I have of what actually happened, not the version that was handed to me in a parking lot, but the one that took months to surface, the way the real shape of things usually does. My father knew me. He signed a will with his real hands when they were still steady. He left me the house where I had learned everything I knew about staying. That is enough. That is finally exactly enough.